My family called me the handyman. Funny how quiet it got when I stopped fixing. So last Thanksgiving, my dad called me the family handyman in front of 12 relatives, like it was a compliment. Everyone laughed, clinking their beers, and I smiled too. But the truth? It stung. Because what he really meant was, you're useful, not loved, not appreciated, just useful. I was 31, covered in paint stains, and living back in my parents' old farmhouse in rural Ohio, patching up a roof that had been leaking since I was a kid. My brother Mike had a new truck and a fiancé. My mom spent her days watching Hallmark movies. And me? I was the one holding the place together, one loose shingle at a time. The irony is, I wasn't even supposed to be here. A year ago, I had a life, a small apartment in Columbus, a job at a home design firm, a boyfriend who said he loved how independent I was. But when the company downsized, and Mom called crying about how Dad's back is getting worse, I packed up my things and drove home. Just for a few weeks, I told myself. That was 14 months ago. I should have known that once I came back, I'd turn into the family's unpaid repair service again. Every morning, Dad would call from the porch, "Lily, the gutter's dripping again," or "Can you check the water heater?" Like I was on payroll. Mike, my brother, never lifted a finger. "You're better at this stuff," he'd say, scrolling on his phone while I stood on a ladder in the July heat. I used to think helping was my way of earning love, that if I worked hard enough, fixed enough, they'd finally look at me and see someone they couldn't live without. Turns out I was half right. There was this one afternoon, I remember because it was brutally hot. The kind of day where the air sticks to your skin and the tools burn your hands. I was halfway through sealing the roof when Dad came out with a beer. "You've got a good hand for this, kiddo," he said, squinting up at me. "Wish your brother took after you." Everyone laughed again. I smiled, pretending it was praise, but inside it felt like someone twisting a knife. That night, lying in my childhood bed, I realized something terrifying. If I stopped fixing things, they'd have no reason to keep me around. I started having trouble sleeping after that. The kind where your mind replays every conversation, every disappointment. I'd stare at the ceiling, listening to the old pipes moan, wondering if that's what I sounded like too. Just another thing in this house breaking quietly. I told Mom once that I was exhausted, that maybe we should hire someone. She frowned. "Why waste money when we have you?" And there it was, the invisible contract I'd signed without realizing it. My labor was love. My exhaustion was loyalty. The collapse came slowly. First, I forgot to eat. Then I forgot what day it was. One morning, I went out to clean the gutters, and suddenly everything spun. The next thing I remember, I was lying on the kitchen floor, the sunlight sharp and white against the tiles. I woke up in the hospital 2 days later. The nurse said I'd been dehydrated, malnourished, stressed. "You had a breakdown," she said gently. "You need rest." Rest, like it was something you could buy over the counter. I laughed, because if I didn't, I'd cry. When they finally let me use my phone, my hands were trembling. I texted my family. "Hey, I'm in the hospital. Could someone come by?" Then I waited. An hour, 2 that night, nothing. No calls, no messages. The nurse said most families show up within a day. I told her mine was just busy. But the next morning, while scrolling through social media, I saw it. A photo of my family at the community barbecue. My dad holding a beer, Mom smiling, Mike flipping burgers. Caption, "Summer nights with the best crew." My stomach dropped. I zoomed in, hoping maybe it was an old post. It wasn't. It had been uploaded an hour ago. That's when something inside me cracked. Not the loud kind of crack, the quiet kind, like when glass bends before it shatters. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just stared at the photo until my phone went dark. I realized they could live perfectly fine without me, maybe even happier. I'd spent years patching their walls, unclogging their drains, rewiring their outlets. But I couldn't fix the hole they'd carved inside me. When I was discharged 3 days later, no one was there to pick me up. The nurse asked if I needed a ride. I said no, called an Uber, and rode home in silence. The world outside looked the same, but it felt different, like someone had peeled off a layer of illusion I didn't know was there. The air tasted sharper, the quiet felt heavier. I unlocked my apartment door, and for the first time, I didn't feel guilty for being alone, just empty. But even that felt like progress. That night, I made myself a cup of coffee and stood by the window. The streetlight flickered, the city hummed faintly, and for the first time I thought, maybe peace isn't something you find. Maybe it's what's left when you stop begging for noise. When I got back to my small apartment in Columbus, everything looked the same, but I didn't. My couch still had that coffee stain from last winter, the kitchen light still flickered like it was trying to die, and the air still smelled faintly like burnt toast. But the silence, it felt heavier, the kind that presses on your chest and asks, "So, what now?" I thought maybe my phone would light up. Maybe Mom would text a late sorry, or Dad would say he didn't mean to ignore me, but nothing came. 3 days passed, then 5. The only message I got was from my landlord reminding me rent was due. Figures. I tried to keep busy. At first I cleaned everything, twice. Then I sat at my desk and opened my old sketchbook, the one from when I still dreamed of starting a small interior design studio. The pages smelled like pencil lead and possibility. I hadn't touched them since before I moved back home. My hand shook as I drew the first line. An empty room, sunlight spilling across the floorboards. It wasn't much, but it felt like breathing again. Somewhere deep down, I realized that fixing things for everyone else had nearly killed me. Maybe it was time to start rebuilding something that actually belonged to me. A week later, my phone finally buzzed. For a second, I felt that old panic, hope disguised as anxiety. But when I looked, it wasn't concern. It was a text from my brother. "Hey, the garage door's jammed again. You remember what you did last time?" I stared at it for a while, thumb hovering over reply, then just locked the screen. 2 hours later, Mom called. "No, how are you? Just, your father can't get the water heater to work. Can you stop by this weekend?" I almost laughed. I wanted to scream. I was in the hospital, and you didn't even show up, but the words stayed stuck in my throat. Instead, I just said, "I'm busy," and hung up. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel guilty for saying no. That night, I sat on the balcony with a cup of coffee and my old cracked laptop. The city lights blinked like distant stars. I started browsing freelance design gigs, small stuff at first. Living room layouts, home office remodels. Nothing fancy, just something to remind myself I was more than a fixer with a toolbox. I sent out 3 proposals and figured I'd never hear back. But the next morning, someone replied. A retired teacher named Mrs. Callahan wanted me to help her redesign her guest room into a small art studio. She wrote, "I can pay a little, but I mostly want someone who listens." Something about that line hit me. Maybe because no one in my family had truly listened in years. When I showed up at her house that weekend, she greeted me with lemonade and a smile that felt like summer. Her walls were covered in old family photos, happy faces frozen in time. She said, "It's hard to let go, isn't it?" I didn't know if she meant the furniture or the people. By the end of the day, I'd helped her move an easel by the window, patched a hole in the wall, and painted one corner a soft sage green. When she handed me the check, I hesitated. "You don't have to," I said. She smiled gently. "You earned it." I think that was the first time anyone had said that to me without strings attached. Driving home, I caught myself smiling. Not the forced kind I used to wear at family dinners, but the quiet, surprised kind that sneaks up on you. The kind that feels like peace trying to make a comeback. But peace is a strange thing. It doesn't last long when people are used to your chaos. That night, Dad left a voicemail. "We can't get the roof patched. You know what you're doing, Lily. We need you." His voice wasn't angry. It was entitled, like a boss reminding an employee to clock in. I deleted it without listening to the rest. Then I posted a photo of my coffee cup and the morning skyline with a simple caption. "Sometimes silence is self-respect." An hour later, my brother texted again. "Must be nice ignoring everyone while the house is falling apart." I just typed back, "Guess you'll learn to fix it then." He didn't respond. That weekend, I went to the flea market downtown and bought a second-hand drafting table. It had scratches and initials carved into it. JR 1987, someone else's story before mine. I placed it by my apartment window, right where the morning light hit. Every day after that, I spent an hour sketching something new, sometimes a room, sometimes a future. And with every line I drew, I realized something. I wasn't angry anymore. I was just done. Done explaining, done fixing, done begging to be seen. One evening, Mrs. Callahan called me out of the blue. "I showed your design to my friend. She wants to hire you too." My heart actually skipped. It wasn't about the money. It was that someone wanted me for what I could create, not what I could repair. I said yes, of course. After we hung up, I sat on the floor, surrounded by open sketchbooks, feeling this odd mix of pride and disbelief. Like maybe I was finally building something that couldn't collapse on me. Later that night, another voicemail came in, from Mom this time. Her voice was softer than usual. "Your father's worried. We just miss you." But I knew what she meant. They missed what I did for them, not me. Still, for a moment, I almost called back. Old habits die hard. Then I looked around, my small apartment, my drawings, the table with sunlight waiting for morning, and I whispered to myself, "They'll be fine, they always are." And maybe, for once, I finally believed it. About a month later, I got a call from an unknown number. Normally I ignore those, but something told me to pick up. "Hi, this is Greg from Community First Bank. I'm calling to confirm your co-signature on the Thompson home repair loan." I remember blinking, confused. "My what?" He cleared his throat. "Your parents listed you as a guarantor. Just need your verbal okay." I froze. My stomach dropped so fast I thought I might be sick. I told him as calmly as I could, "Greg, if my name is on anything, it's fraud. Do not approve that loan." He stammered an apology and said he'd flag it. I hung up and just sat there, staring at my reflection in the black laptop screen. My own family had tried to use my name to get money. I shouldn't have been surprised, but somehow I still was. I could feel the anger boiling in a way it hadn't before. It wasn't the sad kind, the hollow ache I'd carried since the hospital. It was sharp, clean, electric. The kind that makes you see everything clearly. For years, I'd been the safety net they didn't even bother to thank. The second I stepped away, they tried to pull me back with paperwork. That night, I called an old friend from my design days, a contractor named Ray. We used to work together on renovations before life went sideways. He still owed me a favor. "Ray," I said, "you still take private jobs?" He chuckled. "Depends who's asking." "My parents," I said. "Their house needs a full repair. Roof, wiring, plumbing, everything." He whistled. "Sounds expensive." "Good," I said. "Give them a real quote, no discounts." There was a pause, then laughter. "Damn, Lily, you're serious." "Dead serious." 2 days later, Ray called back. "I went by the house, told your dad the estimate, 15 grand minimum." I could almost hear my father's face turning red through the phone. "He said you'd pay." I smiled. I bet he did. That evening, my phone lit up with his name. I let it ring 3 times before answering. "Lily, what the hell did you do?" he barked. "You sent some stranger here quoting ridiculous numbers. Are you out of your mind?" I kept my voice steady. "No, Dad, I just stopped working for free." Silence. Then he said it, the line that defined our entire relationship. "We raised you better than this." I let the words hang for a second, then answered softly, "You didn't raise me. You used me." And I hung up. For a few seconds, I just sat there, shaking, waiting for the guilt to crash in. But it never did. Instead, I laughed, quiet, almost disbelieving. It felt like taking my first real breath in years. The next morning, my brother texted me again. "Dad's furious. You're making things harder than they need to be." I typed back. Maybe it's time he learned how to fix something himself. Then I blocked his number. I knew they'd call from other phones. I knew there'd be voicemails, guilt trips, threats, maybe even tears. But I was done playing the family mechanic. That night, I posted a picture of my drafting table on my Instagram story. Sunlight on blueprints, coffee mug half full, with the caption, "Sometimes cutting ties is the real home improvement." It blew up more than I expected. A few of my old coworkers messaged, saying they related. One woman wrote, "You just described my mom." Another said, "Proud of you for choosing peace." It was weird, reading strangers echo my thoughts, but it made me realize something. Maybe this wasn't just about me. Maybe this was about every person who's ever been told their worth depended on how much they could fix for other people. A few days later, I walked past my parents' house out of curiosity. The porch light was flickering, the roof still sagging, the paint peeling worse than ever. It looked exactly how it felt to live there, barely held together, pretending not to fall apart. I parked across the street, scribbled a short note on a napkin, and slipped it into their mailbox. It said, "Don't ever use my name again." Then I drove off, hands steady on the wheel, music low, heart strangely calm. For years, they'd convinced me that walking away was selfish. But now I understood, it was survival. And maybe, just maybe, letting the house collapse was the only way for all of us to finally see what needed rebuilding. After that day, things went quiet for a while. Too quiet. No calls, no texts, not even one of Mom's guilt-laced voicemails. I figured they'd finally given up trying to reel me back in. But silence from my family has always been suspicious, like the calm before a storm. Sure enough, 2 weeks later, Mrs. Callahan stopped me after one of our design sessions, holding her phone with that awkward, hesitant look people get when they don't know if they should tell you something. "Honey, is your dad the one driving that old red pickup?" she asked. "He's been asking around town about you. Said you're refusing to help with their house and he doesn't know what he did wrong." I laughed, but it came out bitter. He knows exactly what he did. Turns out, the house really was falling apart this time. The roof had started leaking again, the pipes froze that winter, and the county sent a letter about code violations. They'd hired a handyman who overcharged and bailed halfway through the job. A neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins, the same woman who once told me I should be grateful for having parents who still need me, came by my studio one morning. "Your poor mother," she said, voice syrupy with pity. "She's been so sick lately. Maybe you should call them." I stared at her for a second, then said, "Did she tell you I was in the hospital too?" She blinked, thrown off. "Oh, I didn't know." "Exactly," I said, and went back to my sketches. But that night, lying in bed, I couldn't shake what she'd said. Sick. It wasn't guilt I felt. It was something messier. Maybe nostalgia, maybe the echo of who I used to be. So I did what I always do when I can't sleep. I worked. I poured myself into designing a community center for seniors, something the town council had been talking about for years, but never actually built. When I submitted the concept proposal, I didn't expect anything. But a month later, they called. They wanted to fund it. It wasn't a huge project, but it was mine, and that was enough. The first day I walked into the empty building, sunlight spilling through dusty windows, I felt this weird sense of symmetry. I used to fix my parents' crumbling house. Now I was restoring a place that might actually help people. Mrs. Callahan showed up with muffins, and a few locals came to volunteer. One of them was a guy named Chris, quiet, mid-30s, tattoo peeking from under his sleeve. Turned out he'd gone to high school with my brother. "You're that Lily?" he said, surprised. "Mike always said you were the tough one." I laughed. Funny, he never said that to me. Meanwhile, word about the Thompson house spread around town. People finally saw the truth. The family that used to brag about self-reliance couldn't hold it together without the daughter they'd taken for granted. My dad started showing up at the hardware store, asking for discounts, arguing with contractors. Someone even posted a photo of him yelling at the clerk. The comments were brutal. "Guess karma's real," one said. I didn't like that it made me feel satisfied, but I can't lie, it did. It felt like watching justice unfold, slow but steady. Then one Sunday morning, my phone buzzed. It was Mom. Her voice was tired, quieter than I'd ever heard it. "Lily, I'm not calling to ask for help. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. We pushed too hard. We thought you were strong enough for all of us." For a moment, I didn't say anything. I just stared out the window at the mural we'd painted on the community center wall. Bright colors, open sky. "You mistook strength for invincibility," I finally said. "There's a difference," she exhaled softly. "I know that now." After we hung up, I sat there for a long time. I didn't cry, but something inside me loosened. I wasn't sure if I forgave them, not really. But maybe forgiveness wasn't the point. Maybe just breaking the cycle was enough. That afternoon, Chris stopped by the center with takeout. "You look lighter," he said, handing me a sandwich. "Yeah," I smiled. Maybe because I finally stopped trying to fix the wrong house. He laughed, and for the first time in a long time, I laughed with him. Not out of irony or exhaustion, just because it felt good. As I locked up that evening, the sun hit the freshly painted sign, Thompson Community Room. It wasn't about reclaiming the name, it was about rewriting it. And standing there, paint on my hands, I realized something simple but freeing. Sometimes the best revenge isn't destruction. It's reconstruction, just not where they expect it. A few months later, the community center officially opened. The mayor cut a ribbon that looked like it cost $5 off Amazon, but I didn't care. Watching people walk through the doors, kids laughing, retirees setting up their art supplies, volunteers bringing boxes of donated books, felt surreal. For once, I wasn't cleaning up after a mess someone else made. I was building something from the ground up, Something mine. Mrs. Callahan hugged me so tight I could barely breathe. "You did it, kid," she whispered. I smiled. "No," I said, "we did." After the ceremony, I sat on the steps outside, sipping bad coffee from a paper cup and watching the crowd thin out. That's when I saw them, my family, mom, dad, and even my brother, standing near the parking lot. For a moment, I thought about walking away, pretending not to see them, but then Mom waved. Her movements were slow, careful. She looked smaller somehow, fragile, so I walked over. "Place looks good," Dad said first, eyes darting around, avoiding mine. "Heard you designed it." "I did," I said. He nodded, like he didn't quite know what to do with that. "Guess you finally found something worth fixing." I smiled, not bitterly this time. "Yeah, just not what you thought needed fixing." Mom reached out, her hand trembling. "We wanted to come see you," she said. No strings attached. For a moment, I didn't trust it. Then I saw the way my brother shifted awkwardly, hands in his pockets, guilt written all over him. Maybe they weren't there to manipulate me this time. Maybe they were just there. We stood in silence for a while. The kind that used to suffocate me but now just felt quiet. Peaceful even. Finally, I said, "You know, I used to think I had to hold everything together. The house, the family, the love. But I realized, if you're the only one holding something up, it's not a home. It's scaffolding." Dad looked down, jaw tight, but he didn't argue. They left soon after, and I didn't cry. I didn't feel triumphant or vindicated, just steady. I went back inside, where the smell of fresh paint and new beginnings hung in the air. The kids were drawing on the chalkboard wall, and one of them had written in crooked letters, "Fixing doesn't always mean repairing." I laughed quietly. Smart kid. Later that night, I sat on my apartment balcony again, same chair, same coffee mug, same skyline. But it didn't feel like the same life. My phone buzzed once, a message from Chris. "You left early, everyone loved your speech." I typed back, "Didn't give one." He replied, "Exactly." I smiled, because he got it. Some stories don't need to be told out loud. As the city lights flickered below, I thought about everything, the breakdown, the silence, the boundaries, the rebuilding. How people think strength is about endurance, about holding on no matter what. But sometimes, real strength is knowing when to let go. I took one last sip of coffee, leaned back, and whispered to the night, "They were right about one thing. I do have good hands." Then I smiled. I just finally learned where to use them. For the first time, peace didn't feel like a pause between disasters. It felt like home. In the end, I realized something simple but life-changing. Peace isn't found in fixing what's broken. It's found in finally letting go of what was never mine to fix. For so long, I thought love meant endurance. That being the one who stayed, the one who helped, the one who held everything together somehow made me worthy. But the truth is, being needed isn't the same as being loved. Sometimes the people who claim to love you the most only love what you can do for them. And when you stop giving, they vanish. It hurts, deeply, but it's also the most honest mirror you'll ever face. I used to think walking away meant failure. Now I know it means freedom. Boundaries aren't walls, they're doors that you finally learn to close. Not to shut people out, but to protect the peace you fought to build. People will call you selfish, dramatic, cold. Let them. You can't pour from an empty cup, and no amount of guilt will ever fill it again once it's been drained dry. They eventually reached out again, a little softer, a little humbler, and I forgave them, but this time on my terms. Because forgiveness isn't about erasing the past, it's about reclaiming your future. So if you're listening to this and carrying the weight of being the strong one, I hope this story reminds you that it's okay to set it down. You deserve rest. You deserve peace. If this story resonated with you, share your thoughts below, or tell me about the moment you finally chose yourself. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more stories that hit where it hurts and heal where it matters. Take care of your heart, my friend. The quiet you're afraid of, that's where peace begins.